All right, welcome everyone. I'm Christy Gagnon, a program manager for Telehealth Rocks. Telehealth Rocks is a federally funded program that focuses on school-based behavioral health, and we do this by focusing on social determinants, supporting school-based services, and telemetry and trainings just like this one. We are glad you're here to discuss early childhood and from an educational lens today. We've got just a few notes for you as we get started. This session is being recorded and we'll send it to you afterwards. Your microphones have been muted, but feel free to use the chat or unmute to ask questions. And then it's super helpful to have your first and last name visible on your Zoom screen or typed into the chat. All right, we don't have any disclosures and everything presented today is evidence-based and currently accepted within the profession. Just a few notes for after the session. We'll share the slides and recording afterwards through email to everybody. We'll include any of the links and resources that we share today during the presentation. And then our certificates of attendance will be emailed after this series ends. And then we're excited to have Andrea Scott, the educational consultant from Greenbush, presenting the didactic lesson today. I'll just briefly introduce, we've got Barbara Unell, Robert Unell, and Jerry Wyckoff from the Raised with Love and Limits Foundation, and Alice Young from the University of Kansas Medical Center. They'll all join us during the case discussion. So I will now hand it to Andrea to get us started.
Great, thank you. Today we're going to go over a few objectives. The first is that we are going to review the basic nervous system, development, and then attachment, and then consider instruction, curriculum, environment, the learner when we're using problem solving and regulation issues. Then we're also going to recognize elements at play that naturally differentiate instruction and curriculum and environment. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a picture of the brain. This brain is adapted by Dr. Bruce Perry, and what we use a lot of his theories, and the picture of the brain is really self-explanatory here. So I'm going to start from the brain works from the bottom up and the inside out, meaning that we have to start from the brainstem when we're thinking about how the brain works. So if you see right there in the blue, Christy, would you mind putting your cursor over the blue? Very good. So you're starting from your brainstem. Your brainstem controls your heart rate, your breathing, your temperature, your blood regulation. So congratulations, all of you that are sitting here today, participating in our didactic today. You are using your brainstem, and that is developed in utero. So by the time the mother misses her second menstrual cycle, so at 8 weeks, the brain and the heart are developing. So the heart is already developed and the brain is continuing to develop. So this happens in utero. Most often, sometimes mothers do not even know they're expecting at 8 weeks pregnancy. So keep that in mind. Then we have our second stage, which is a cerebellum, and that develops in utero and beyond. So Christy, thank you for putting the cursor over there. And that controls your motor coordination, your balance, your eye movement, all of those wonderful things that we see happening when a child is in utero. Then we have our next stage, and that is the diencephalon. And that is really where you control your motor regulation, your sleep, wake arousal, your attention, and your appetite and your safety. So all of those things are happening in infancy or in the utero, that first 9 months of pregnancy. Keeping that in mind, that infancy stage is very critical because that's when a child is aware of when they're tired, when they're full, when they're feeling safety. So all of that happens within the central nervous system and the brain. And sometimes we do not have control of any of those things from the diencephalon. And also the diencephalon is considered or called the midbrain. So diencephalon and down, all of those things are happening in utero or in infancy. Next, we have our limbic system right there in the orange. You'll see that controls our memory, our emotional reaction, our pleasure, reward, our attachment, our bonding. So oftentimes you'll see that a lot of our teenagers live here because it's our emotional reaction. So when we think of emotional reaction, think of maybe a toddler that you're asking them to do something, or you ask them if they want something. Sometimes their emotional reaction is maybe unsettled, or maybe they start to cry or fuss. And sometimes that child may be living in that limbic system, or Maybe you're in a situation yourself and someone asks you to calm down after you've been very upset very quickly. And when they ask you to calm down, you're stuck in that limbic stage. And so when they say, "Hey, I need you to calm down," your emotional reaction to that is maybe wouldn't normally be as calm as you would be if you were more in your cortex. Okay. And then the next stage is the cortex. So that starts from the frontal lobe and all the way back to back towards your brainstem. And that controls your your reasoning, your creativity, your planning, your sense of time, understanding your past, present, speech and language. And so children that are going into that they're learning their speech and language, that really has to have the activation in the frontal cortex, values and beliefs. So keep in mind, so I'm going to have everybody go ahead and close their eyes and think of a child that they've been working with for the last maybe few years, or maybe it's your own child. And picture that child. Now, picture them when maybe they're throwing a fit. What do they do? Maybe they're throwing a fit on the floor. Maybe they've had something happen to them at school, and you're saying, "Hey, little Johnny, hey, little Sally, I need you to calm down." But they're unable to because of things that have happened, and maybe they've been exposed to toxic stress. Okay, open up your eyes. Now, when I say toxic stress or trauma, that can cause cracks in the foundation of the house, meaning that that blood flow has to go all the way up from the brainstem and to the frontal cortex in order for the activation to happen between all 5 of those stages of the brain. So keeping in mind all of that, that if there are toxic stress that is unpredictable or unpatterned, or that we don't have any control over, that's when, or sometimes prolonged, that's when we have cracks in the foundation. And sometimes children live in those stages for longer periods of time. And we call these developmental risk factors.
Okay, so I'm sure many of you are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs: food, shelter, water, psychological safety, right? So if you're looking at the pyramid, it has a very bottom, it says psychological. So we're thinking about basic needs. We as adults can naturally fill our own holes, meaning that if we're tired, we can get something, or we can sleep. If we're hungry, we get something to eat or drink. And so we know that that's provides us some psychological safety, right? We're saying, "Hey, I got up this morning, I went to school, I had the same routines and everything, and I felt safe." Then we have belonging, which is forming relationships with adults and our friendships all the time. And then we have our self-esteem and our self-actualization. So think of that brain as your pyramid, right? Your upside down kind of triangle. When you think about all those things as adults, like I said, we can fill our holes. We can make ourselves feel safe. What we can provide food, shelter, water. However, when it comes to toxic stress for a child or trauma, they cannot naturally fill their holes, especially if they have a developmental delay or developmental risk factor. And I'll go into those in just a moment. Okay, next slide, Christy. Thank you. So here's a list that has been adapted, and I'm going to refer to this as developmental risk factors. So first on the left side, you have an interuterine insult or disruption. So you have a mother that has maybe a difficult pregnancy. We know that drugs and alcohol can absolutely affect the fetus, right? But sometimes we forget that a mother that is anxious during pregnancy or that is depressed, that can be very difficult for that brain development, because that causes sometimes prolonged and toxic stress that's unpredictable. So we also have difficult birth. Difficult birth meaning maybe there's been an emergency during the birthing process, maybe an emergency cesarean, maybe there has been the child was maybe stuck in the birth canal for a period of time. That can also be prolonged and toxic stress for a period of time, and also can prevent blood flow from going from the brainstem all the way up to the frontal cortex. Okay. I am not going to talk about disruption attachment, but I'll come back to that here in just a minute. And then we have on the right-hand side, we have trauma and toxic stress. So not everything is traumatic, right? But sometimes we have toxic stress. So early hospitalizations, meaning that we have medical issues, early surgeries at a very early age. We know abuse and neglect, all of those things can really disrupt that brain development. But again, at the very bottom is set, it refers to chronic stress. So it is prolonged, intense, unpredictable, things that can really be, like the Maslow's hierarchy notes, really be hard on a child's development and in utero as well. Okay. So I want to go back to the early hospitalizations. I always tell this story, no matter when I'm talking about this, but I personally have a child, she's an adult now, that has had many, many early hospitalizations, and she's had 5 open heart surgeries. So it didn't really matter what I did as a parent. I tried my very best, but sometimes those prolonged and unpredictable hospital stays or surgeries really caused a lot of stress and toxic stress to her body. So when I referred to her, as I would ask her, hey, how are you feeling right now? Sometimes she didn't have the words to say, or sometimes she was scared. That's because of that brainstem, that blood flow was not coming from the brainstem all the way to the frontal cortex, which resulted in prolonged anxiety and depression. So now she's 25, she's doing very well, and she's a teacher. So, which is a mini miracle itself. However, those early hospitalizations, I also want to refer to you to the early hospitalizations or doctor visits that our children go to on a regular basis. Maybe they have ear infections, maybe they have tummy issues, maybe they have digestive issues. All of those things can be prolonged and unpredictable, right? Because sometimes when we walk in the doctor's office, or hospital emergency room, we don't always know what to expect. And some of that fear factor comes in, and those can be prolonged and toxic. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to just refer to this. This is actually a video that will talk about the brain and builders, and it really explains how our brain works and how we have to work together to co-regulate the body in order for our nervous systems to talk to each other and the blood flow to get all the way from the brainstem all the way up to the frontal cortex. Next slide, please. And Christy, she's going to put the link in the slide. Okay. So here we have the cycle of attachment. Cycle of attachment, right? What does a baby do when they're tired, cold, or hungry? Somebody just shout out or put it in the chat. What do they do without looking at the screen too much? Cry. Okay, very good. Thank you for that, Deb. So when they're tired, cold, or hungry, they have a way to communicate with us, and they say, "Ah, oh, I'm hungry, caregiver, meet my needs," right? Here's the cycle of attachment. This comes from the National Training and Development of Curriculum, and this comes from many foster care providers have to go through this training. So the baby cries and they're saying, "Hey, I'm hungry, I'm here, please help me." And so the baby starts to cry, right? And their stress responses are then activated, meaning that, hey, I'm crying, I need something. And the baby continues that, and their legs, their facial expressions start to move, and sometimes they have some rapid movements. And then the caregiver then meets their needs and saying, "Oh, baby, let me help you. I'm going to feed you. I'm going to change you. I'm going to comfort you. I'm going to rock you. I'm going to meet that need." And then their stress responses start to settle down because the caregiver is providing them protection, safety, and they feel secure, right? If you've ever had anybody that you live with, or maybe that is just your go-to person to say, "Hey, I'm really upset right now, but I really need to talk." Maybe that is your person of safety, and they're filling your holes, right? They are filling that need for comfort, and then your stress responses start to slow down. So next slide, please. Okay, so when we're thinking of an infant, there are lots of things that happen in early infancy, meaning there's a thing called serve and return. We do serve and return all the time. Sometimes it's really hard to do on Zoom because there's not a lot of interaction that's happening there and we're on screens. However, serve and return is really just what it says. It is the function under our visual and auditory capacities, fill our cognitive, social, and emotional regulation later in life. Okay, we continue to serve and return, but there are studies that show that infants, after 8 hours after birth, as early as 8 hours after birth, they can begin for engaging in some serve and return. Okay, with their caregiver and mother. I would assume that would be the mother primarily. However, but if it's not, it could be the father, meaning serve and return. So they are looking at the parents looking back at them. Sometimes they might stick out their tongue and vice versa. So those can happen very quickly, but those connections can actually rewire some of the brain, and they can allow synapses to go to the neurons, meaning that they're growing and firing, and we're regulating the nervous system very naturally. So if a child is in let's use the example, if a child is in a preschool classroom and the teacher comes up to them and say, "Oh, I'm so glad to see you, Johnny," and then they have some back and forth exchanges, that is actually serve and return. It's very naturally happening. And or if I say, "Good morning, Christy, how are you today?" then she's providing some feedback to me and I'm providing some feedback to her. And that is also serve and return as adults. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is where I'm going to talk about the central nervous system. When we think of the central nervous system, it is truly, I'm going to refer to the autonomic nervous system. You're going to see on your left the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, so the sympathetic nervous system I'm going to refer to as your gas, right? It's saying, "Hey, that's my gas," and then the parasympathetic is your brake. So you're going to see my hands go back and forth. So when the baby cries, when they're saying, "Hey, I'm tired, cold, or hungry," that is an activation of their sympathetic nervous system, their gas. They're saying, "Hey, I need something right now from you. I need you to come provide something for me." So then the caregiver comes and they're saying, "Oh, baby, here I am." And they're the parasympathetic nervous system. The nervous systems are talking to each other without us really knowing. Like it's not like we say, "Hey, nervous system, I need you to be activated." It's truly saying, "Hey, activation, baby cries, caregiver meets their needs." So over time, an infant from 0 to 9 months or 0 to a year, their central nervous system, autonomic nervous system, is not developed without the ebb and the flow of somebody meeting their needs. And this happens thousands and thousands of times for that central nervous system to mature over that first year of life. So if a child has had prolonged and toxic stress and their caregiver is unable to meet their needs, then there could be a disruption in the regulation of the nervous system. Regulation is not a developmental milestone. So I'm going to say that again. Regulation is not a developmental milestone. It's not something that we achieve at a certain age. It's something that we are continuously working on. But we need a caregiver, and it doesn't have to always be the mom. It doesn't always have to be the dad, but it has to be someone that's providing. So Robin Goebel is another psychologist that really works a lot with developmental trauma and toxic stress. And she refers to a parent or caregiver has to meet over that first year or 9 months of life 1 billion times in order for that central nervous system to be mature. There are some really good resources of Robin Goebel, and we can provide those to you later. So I want you to go, let's go back to a couple of slides, Christy. How am I doing on time? Okay. One more slide, please. I want to show, there you go. So the cycle of attachment. So keep in mind the cycle of attachment, right? The activation of the sympathetic nervous system, the baby is crying, then the caregiver starts to settle down the baby when they meet the needs, and the activation happens. Oh, hello, there's some fireworks happening there. And then their activation of all of that is happening. Can you go back one more slide, Christy, and then we're going to skip ahead. One more, sorry. Okay, so when I'm referring to this cycle of attachment, I'm truly referring to the attachment disruption of unmet needs. So that is referred to low to no external modulation. So when a child has had low external modulation, meaning that they have not had a caregiver meet their needs, the back and forth, the sympathetic nervous system says, "Hey, I've got the gas. I need somebody to be my brake." That's what I'm referring to. Okay, go ahead and go back to the original slide, Christy, if you would, please. Okay, thank you. One more slide. So regulation, truly, when I say the ebb and the flow of the acceleration and the brake without disruption, we want to see this. We've got arousal happening, the sympathetic nervous system, and then we settle down. All of this is an ebb and flow thing that continues to happen. We want to see this. And Dan Siegel refers to this as the regulation of the central nervous system. So that co-regulation, that serve and return aspects are happening with the child on a regular basis. And it's okay if they get upset as long as they have someone to meet those needs. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm going to give you a couple of things that we can help when I say co-regulation. Again, a reminder, our central nervous systems always talk to each other. We're not saying, hey, central nervous system, I need you to activate. It's not that easy. It's really, truly, our central nervous systems are talking to each other all the time. So if I walk into a room and somebody is really dysregulated, I have to do some techniques for myself. Therefore, my body will then get dysregulated. So if I'm not breathing, I'm not taking some deep breaths. Right when we started this, I noticed that I was talking a lot faster. So I wrote down on my piece of paper beside me saying, slow down and take a breath, right? Meaning that I'm reminding my central nervous system, hey, calm down, take a breath. They just want to hear what you have to say and we'll move forward, right? So when I'm thinking about and there's nobody else in this room to co-regulate with me, so I have to verbally remind myself and write something down. So I'm providing myself with a visual. So I'm going to use this co-regulation, the acronym of love. So if we want to, so Christy, I'm going to use you as an example just because you're in my top right-hand corner of my screen right now. So if remember Christy she came into my office and she was super upset. So I'm going to look at Christy with soft eyes because when I say soft eyes, that is a direct link to her heart because that really just goes into our soul. Then I'm giving her some compassion. I'm showing her, hey, I'm empathizing with you. Then we have observe without judgment. Oh my gosh, this sometimes is so hard, right? Sometimes parents maybe come into our classrooms, our childcare centers, whatever, and we're like, oh, if you would just get your kid here on time, we wouldn't have a problem and they wouldn't be dysregulated, right? Some things, and it's really hard to really observe without judgment and consider the nervous system and the pathways. And when I refer to pathways, I'm talking about the brainstem all the way up to the frontal cortex that we refer to longer. Okay. And when I refer to the central nervous system, I'm talking about the gas and the brake. Then validate when we are witnessing a struggle, saying, oh, Christine, I'm really sorry that you're having a hard time. And then that soothing serve and return. So my body and her body were back and forth exchanging, and she's able to then eventually calm down because she feels, sees, and hears my body of what I'm doing and how I'm reacting. That is the same for any child. So if we're able, not talking like up here with them, like above their head, but if we're down on their level, our central nervous systems are going to talk to each other, and we are going to validate that child. Experience safety by sharing yourself with the child. Earlier, I just shared myself with you that I myself as a parent have had some struggles with my own child. And so therefore I am saying, hey, I'm sharing myself with you, but also you can share yourself with the child. But also you won't always get it right. And you have to have some soothing serve and return, and also the rupture and repair. So as an adult, especially but mother of adult children, that is super hard for me, right? Saying, oh, I was wrong about that. But sometimes if we say, oh, child, Johnny's important today, right? So if we're saying, I'm so sorry that happened, and next time I'm going to try this so in order I can do it right. So that again is rewiring some of those neurons in the brain. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to refer to the ISIL framework. The ISIL framework is truly what it says. We're looking at instruction, curriculum, and environment. So when I go and observe classrooms and they say, hey, I'm having a lot of problems with Sally. She's really active and there's lots of things going on. I'm going to refer always to, I'm going to look at instruction that's happening, curriculum, and then in the environment. And then lastly, the learner. So I may not be watching the learner. I may be watching all of those things that are happening in the classroom because those things are what we can change. The learner is not always something that we can change very quickly. Next slide, please. Okay, so this in front of you is is a matrix, and that comes from the Center of Multi-Tiered Systems of Supports. And this truly is when we are looking at the ISIL framework, and we are going to provide this as a link for you. So when we're thinking about early childhood, we're asking questions like instruction, how teaching methods support or hinder self-regulation, curriculum, designing flexible content that supports diverse learners, and then environment, sensory, friendly spaces, predictable routines, emotional, and safety. So keep in mind, if we're providing routines, structures, and safety within the classroom, we are truly rewiring some of that child's brain so they feel safe in that environment. And then finally, the learner. We're looking at recognize that individual's needs and also strengths. We have to support that child in their strengths area and any triggers that they may have. So this will be provided for you later as a link. Next slide, please. And then let's talk about play. So truly, when we're thinking about free play versus guided play, free play is without disruption. We're allowing children to play because free play or play is truly where children can naturally regulate and it's regulation. So when I think of guided play is really where the teacher or the educator is setting up an environment for that child to, they're saying, hey, I'm going to put this something out because they're trying to teach a skill or teach something to guide their play efforts. Next slide. Okay. If you were not aware, there are actually 6 stages of play. There's a link right above that says 6 stages of play, and that will take you to pathways.org. Pathways.org has a wonderful video. It only takes a few seconds to watch, and it explains each stage of play. So we have an occupied play, which starts between 0 to 3 months. There's solitary play, onlooker play, parallel play, associative play. Next slide, please. So also when we're referring to the 6 stages of play, I also have to refer to the Kansas Early Learning Standards. For the sake of time, we don't have time to go into this, but I want you to really utilize the Kansas Early Learning Standards because that has a wonderful breakdown. I would also encourage you to look at the approaches to learning because we can absolutely link approaches to learning. So when we say, oh, what does it mean for a child to be kindergarten ready, right? In early childhood, and I'm going to refer 0 to 5 years, our whole goals oftentimes as educators or providers is to say, I've got to get this kid ready for kindergarten. But if they don't have self-regulation, then it's going to be very difficult for them to learn their ABCs and letters and numbers, right? So we have to make sure that we are providing adequate amount of play and regulation for that child. And we can also refer to, hey, can the child follow directions? Can they stay on task? Can they do certain things? Having them be at the circle time for 20 minutes isn't necessarily realistic because normally we can only as adults pay attention for about 10 minutes and then we tend to disassociate. Okay. So you're looking down at your phone, you're picking up your pen, you might be talking to your neighbor, all of those things. So if you want us to have a starting place, this is a great guide. And it also helps with data collection measures. So we'll also provide that later. And Christy and I can develop something if that helps to explain this a little bit better. Next slide, please. Okay. These are some supports and resources when I'm talking about that ISIL framework. ISIL framework really goes back to children a lot of times, remember that frontal cortex controls our language. But if we have toxic stress, developmental risk factors, or developmental delays, it's going to be very, very hard for us to say, hey, Sally, you took my toy, I want it back, right? So these are solution cards and resources that will be a very good reminder to their brain to use. I've even used these in my own classroom when I was teaching in my early years of education. And we use these as with a child with autism. This child was nonverbal. He was able to use these. And we taught him very quickly on how to hand a card to a child and say, hey, I want a next turn. Okay. So great, great resource. Next slide, please. The next slide here is oftentimes when we're allowing children to play, as adults, we're like, hey, what color is that? How many do you have? But sometimes we forget that we have to activate the brain and cause some higher order thinking or increase that rigor. So here's a list. They're printables. The center conversation printables, you can go to those and that gives you can put them on your side of your center and that allows people to ask questions or make statements that will help that critical thinking that needs to happen and that blood flow to go from the brainstem all the way to the frontal cortex. So great resource. And to remind you, all of these sources that I'm giving you are free. Okay, next slide. So transitions are very difficult for children that they're just difficult in general, right? Transitions are hard. So when we are thinking about transitions, as educators, we like lists, but this is not a list to check off. It's just reminders. So really adjust our expectations. When we're having kids that have developmental risk factors or anything like that, we have to adjust our expectations. We are not lowering our expectations. We are adjusting them, okay? Based on where they're at in their nervous system or their brain pathway. Stand timers, visuals are wonderful because they're a visual reminder of what the child needs to do next. Play partners, children learn best with each other, not with adults. Adults are wonderful, but they learn from each other and if we can pair them up with another child. Use song. There are things that is, there's songs that will help regulate the central nervous system, and they're on YouTube and they're 60 beat per minute. 60 beat per minute is naturally regulating to the central nervous system because that's what a child heard in utero. So if you just type in 60 beat per minute, we can also provide you with some different resources later, depending on what we have in the rest of the time. Then limit language. If you are going to ask a question, you're going to get an answer from a child. So be ready for that answer. Also, let's make sure that if we are asking too many questions or too many directives, or we're saying, I need you to go put this in the trash, and I need you to do this, and I need you to do this, keep in mind with a child with developmental risk factors or toxic stress, can often that can limit their ability to be able to process information. So the average child, it takes about 10 seconds to process information. If a child has a developmental delay or risk factor, that can actually take 30 seconds or longer for them to process information. And then make transitions fun. Next slide. Did I say 30 seconds or 30 minutes? I think I meant to say 30 seconds, not 30 minutes if I said that. Okay, there's another link here that I want to refer to, the value of emotional regulation over compliance. It's not really about compliance, it's about emotional regulation, and there's some links there for you to look at. Finally, next slide. Here's your 60 beat per minute that I was referring to. If you want to have some hip hop, there's some in there too. Next slide. And then here are what we refer to practices from using the bottom up to top down. So when I refer to the bottom of the brain, that is our bottom brain function. So anything on the left, those are some exercises that you can use, or not exercises, or techniques that you can use, strategies. And then we've got our relational brain if the child's in their limbic system. So that's more referring to the upstairs brain. Okay, next slide. And those are the references that I refer to you today. If you want to look up any of those things, I always recommend Mona De La Hook, Dr. Bruce Perry, and Robin Gopal.
Thanks, everybody. So if you'll let us know, we heard a lot of different ideas and strategies, and if there's anything that you'll take away from this session, you know, a new piece of information you'll share or a link you'll click on, just go ahead and let us know in the chat. We will keep moving this so we can get you out of here on time. Andrea shared some key takeaways with us. Early connections help shape brain development and regulation. Supporting regulation through the ISIL framework is important, and then that play naturally supports diverse learning needs. So we'll share all of these with you afterwards as well. And then we'll see you all at our next session on April 2nd at noon to discuss the parenting perspective. And any of our links, our slides and materials will be sent to your email. They're also available on the Telehealth Rocks Facebook page and website. And we look forward to seeing you in a month where Barbara, Jerry, and Robert will share the parenting perspective. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We hope you have a great rest of your day.